Então, convido vocês a escutarem, a provocarem, a complementarem, a contribuírem com a filantropia para que ela responda ao que ela foi chamada. Fazer com que esse país seja mais equânime, mais justo e mais inclusivo para todos nós. É isso. Super obrigado. Assim começa o 13º Congresso do GIFE. Dito isso, vamos escutar a Abigail Disney. Abigail, eu queria te chamar para estar aqui com a gente em algum lugar. Certamente você está. Aê, muito bem. Bem-vinda. Nós temos aqui algumas perguntas para a Abigail e nós temos também, aqui a minha colinha, que tem um QR Code no crachá de vocês, que vocês também podem mandar pergunta, que se tudo der certo, vai dar tempo de fazer. Mas não garanto. Tá bem? Muito bem. Então, a gente começa aqui, super obrigado. Eu vou falar em português, né? E vou falar para a Inês começar as perguntas. Aqui para você, Abigail.
Obrigada, Abigail. Gente, quem está aqui tem o desafio de conseguir falar com todos os lados, o lado que faz a gente, o lado poesia, o lado competente, o lado que faz a gente ser gente. Então, a gente vai tentar aqui fazer uma plenária conversando com todos os nossos lados, mas nosso desafio. Abigail, muito prazer ter você aqui, é uma honra para a gente. A gente tem, nesses últimos anos, trabalhado... Mais alto? Mais próximo? Mais próximo. Então, está ótimo. Bom, a gente tem, nesses últimos anos, enfatizado o trabalho da filantropia no enfrentamento das estruturas de desigualdade. Então, para a gente, realmente, é muito convergente ter você aqui conversando com a gente. Nesse sentido, eu queria te ouvir, para começar, falando um pouco de você. Quem você é, o que te fez investir seu tempo para estar nesse congresso, o que te motivou a se engajar nas causas sociais?
Well, first of all, I apologize for speaking in English. But I want to start by thanking GIFE. I want to thank you so much for bringing me here. I feel so honored to be here, and I'm so respectful of the work that you do. And I want to thank the feminist funds and the women's funds from all over Latin America who came together to bring me here as well, because they're a very important piece of this puzzle here. The women's funds are certainly what brought me into a meaningful relationship with philanthropy. I started out when I was young. In my family, we had a little family foundation. The thing about family foundations is they tend to have everything in them that makes families crazy. Families are crazy, right? They're all crazy. And so family foundations often are just as crazy as the families who start them. And so that was my beginning, right? I had a kind of contentious relationship with my mother, and I would go and find things that I knew would make my mother angry. So the Gay Men's Health Fund and things like that was delightful, except that we're real people on the other end of that transaction, and I needed to take it more seriously. When I came to New York in the early 1980s, I found this New York Women's Foundation. So when I say it's women's funds who kind of brought me into this, it's where I was a baby philanthropist in the Women's Fund. And the way it was structured was around the idea that things were unequal, gravely unequal in New York, and that rather than being just one subset of the question of inequality, women were right at the center of all of the questions. So rather than saying, well, this week we'll talk about whether the streets are good, and next week we'll talk about the education, and next week we'll talk about whatever else, and then we'll talk about women, we couldn't talk about any of those things unless we were talking about women within them. And what you learn really fast when you're making grants across all of the diversity of New York City and all of the diversity of issues that people were bringing, you learn really fast that even if you weren't looking for women who were trying to answer some of these questions, you would find very quickly women were at the center of trying to answer the questions. It was the women in the neighborhoods who said, this school is not working for us. How are we going to organize around that question? It was the women who said, our water is not clean. Where will we go to find clean water? So as I've come to understand it, everywhere in the world, almost without exception, women do the things like making sure there's clean water, making sure there's education, making sure there's health care, making sure there's school, taking care of the elderly, taking care of the sick. Women do everything except the governments and the wars. And so if you want to find one subject heading for all of those activities, I think the only word you can come up with is life. We do the central things that make life happen. And when we are not okay, nothing is okay. And you know that from inside of your families. If you have children, when the mother is sick, everybody's sick. And when mom is good, when mom is okay, everybody does better. I don't understand why, socially and in philanthropy, we can't bring that lesson to the center. Because what we know is the world, I think I'm feeling this from the people I talk to in Brazil, and I'm certainly feeling this as an American. The world as it's currently functioning is not working. It's not. And at the very center of the terrible situation in the United States is the terrible situation of women. So that is what brought me into the center of philanthropy. It brought me into thinking about how to think about it strategically and how to think about it differently than, well, if somebody's hungry this week, I'll give him food. And starting to think about it in terms of, but why doesn't he have food?
Bom, muito obrigado, Abigail. Eu vou, aqui no nosso jogral, vou falar para vocês, a Inês ia fazer uma outra pergunta também. Só que a Abigail acabou respondendo. Então, eu vou colocar aqui o que vai sobrar mais tempo, inclusive, para talvez perguntas de vocês. Eu queria tocar num tema aqui que é um tema, me parece, Abigail, muito importante para o nosso país, né? Entre outras questões que a gente coloca, o volume de recursos da filantropia brasileira nos parece que potencialmente é abaixo do que é possível ter. Nos Estados Unidos, o volume de investimento filantrópico ele é muito alto comparado, né? A gente sabe também por quê, há incentivos sobre isso. Mas a questão que eu trago aqui é que mesmo nos últimos 40 anos, o volume filantrópico nos Estados Unidos tenha passado de 55 bilhões de dólares para 485 bilhões de dólares, então é um recurso muito grande, também aumentou a desigualdade nos Estados Unidos, né? Então, qual que é a nossa métrica? A nossa métrica é, nós precisamos de mais recursos para ter um país menos desigual. Só que nos Estados Unidos tem muito recurso e aumentou a desigualdade, né? Eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre isso, né? Como é que a gente relaciona volume de recurso com diminuição das desigualdades. Para complicar um pouco mais, eu fico pensando que é um tema muito brasileiro isso. Será que o aumento de volume passa necessariamente por incentivos fiscais? Ou a cultura de doação é o fundamental? Será que teria menos recursos nos Estados Unidos se não houvesse incentivos fiscais? Só pela cultura de doação isso seria suficiente, né? Então, eu te convido a falar um pouco da sua experiência em relação a esses temas.
Right. Yes, we have a larger donation culture precisely because, hang on a second, precisely because we have the tax incentives to do it. So, great, that's good. That's a good thing. Unfortunately, we have an incredibly tax-hostile culture as well, and so a lot of donations happen simply because wealthy people dislike paying taxes so intensely, they'll gladly give it to something else. That $400 billion, unfortunately, is inclusive of donor-advised funds and family foundations that get set up, and very often don't do anywhere near the kind of work in the world that they really should be doing. And if there's that much more, it's because inequality has grown. I mean, to appreciate how much $1 billion is difficult, because the difference between a billion and a million is just this one letter. But that's 1,000 million. A billion is 1,000 million. So if you think of it in terms of 999 million, then suddenly you realize this is a tremendous amount of money. And then you talk about the Elon Musks and the Zuckerbergs and everybody with their $150 billion. In New York City, much of the money for philanthropy comes from middle income and even lower income people. As a proportion of their net worth, poor and middle income people give away more money, sometimes up to 20% of their disposable income, to charity in various ways. Most of that goes to schools and churches and is given out that way. The wealthiest zip codes in New York City give away at most 9% of their disposable income, 9. So it doesn't even compare. And if you consider what 20% is to a middle income person, in terms of the significance of that amount of money to that individual, that's a powerful thing. So philanthropy is a very important piece of a larger puzzle of addressing inequality, but will never address inequality in and of itself. In part because those structures that create the inequality not only stay in place, but are in many cases strengthened by the work that philanthropy can do. So there has to be an understanding that philanthropy has no voter base that can tell it, no, this is not what I want you to spend it on. Philanthropy doesn't have anyone it has to report to other than itself. And philanthropy can stop anytime it wants, and it doesn't have to give any amount over which it chooses to give. So philanthropy can't and shouldn't replace government. And the oligarchy, or we call it a bro-ligarchy, that we face in the United States is partly because people allowed themselves to imagine that the people who were sitting on billions of dollars were nice, and they were going to do nice things for us. They were going to invent spaceships to take us to Mars, and they were going to invent cars that were electric and so forth. And in the process of washing themselves clean or making themselves seem nice, they stepped into and seized an enormous amount of power that we now very much regret letting them have. So it also can be a very tricky and even very treacherous way of people spending their money. If you want to deconcentrate power and wealth and knowledge, people with power and wealth and knowledge have to give some of those things away. And yes, I include power in that. So in thinking about philanthropy, for instance, because we are not accountable to anyone, we need to bring accountability to ourselves. Our processes must be inclusive. They must include the people affected by the problems that we're looking to address. And they have to be systemic. They have to be thinking in terms of changing the nature and the dynamics that cause the hunger, cause the homelessness. And that might actually sound frightening to people with money. You know, there was a survey of wealthy people a few years ago by the Chronicle of Philanthropy that asked people with inherited wealth how much money they would feel like they would need to have to feel totally safe. This is amazing to me. No matter how much money they had inherited, they all named a number that was 2 times what they inherited. So the person who inherited $10 million wanted 20, $100 million wanted $200 million. So the number that they were reaching for to feel safe wasn't an objective number. It was a perception of safety And that safety, I think you'll find in anything, always is a horizon, not a place. Horizons always recede from you as you approach them. So there has to be some understanding of, a social understanding of the notion of what constitutes enough. And it's not something we've talked about ever, and especially not in the United States, what constitutes enough money. And there are beginning to be people, philosophers and economists, talking about something called limitarianism. And I think that we found in the United States especially that given how remarkably difficult it is to hold our government accountable to us, we need to begin to talk about how much money a person should be allowed to not go past in order to contain the power and constrain it so that it becomes something shared and not limited to the people with the most resources.
Eu tinha pedido para fazer provocações, né? A própria Abigail já deu conta de boa parte de algumas boas provocações para a nossa filantropia. Eu que tenho que falar.
I heard provocation.
Tem um outro, em função do baixo volume de recursos filantrópicos que nós temos no país, parece-me que a ideia do capital social e capital político dos filantropos, das grandes indústrias, pode contribuir com mudanças nas políticas públicas, algum tipo de enforcement para que essas mudanças ocorram, né? O seu posicionamento público pode contribuir com a construção de políticas mais equânimes. Essa é uma suposição de que o capital social e político da filantropia pode fazer isso e deve fazer isso. Ao mesmo tempo, parece-me que nos Estados Unidos tem tido uma grande concentração de riqueza, o que faz com que somente algumas pessoas social e seu capital.
It doesn't like you.
O GIFE está me cortando. Então, I'm gonna finish. Então, nos leva a pensar o seguinte: uau, a gente pode criar cidadãs superpoderosas, porque se você usa seu capital social e capital político para influenciar políticas públicas, são aquelas pessoas que estão influenciando políticas públicas e não a população em geral. Então tem um trade-off, como dizem, né? Tem uma compensação. Eu queria te escutar sobre isso. Como utilizar mais o capital social e capital político, como fazer isso e não transformá-los em cidadãos superpoderosos? Porque esse é um dilema que a gente pode enfrentar, espero que a gente enfrente nesse país nos próximos anos.
This is a hard one because in the United States, only 15 years ago, the Supreme Court came to a very damaging decision called Citizens United, which basically just almost took every restriction off of money in politics. But up to that point, there were limits to how much money anybody could give a particular politician or lobbying group. That was a very tragic decision, and then if you consider what was happening 15 years ago in 2010, we had Obama in office, we had the most expensive election in history of the United States to get him reelected, and then in 2016, we elected the first time Donald Trump. And every election since then has gotten more and more and more expensive, and donations from small donors have gotten less and less important. That should scare everybody. It scares me to death. In the 1920s, we had a situation as unequal as we have today. The wealth inequality spread was almost identical. We had heavily concentrated wealth in the hands of a few people who were holding monopoly interests in a handful of the most critical industries. And then came the Depression. And the Depression came in part because of the policies that were being advocated for by the very people who had the most money. right? And by the way, the very wealthy were fine during the Depression. And if there's a depression coming our way, and it really very well could be, in part because of the policies pushed by the people with money, they'll be fine. But we elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. He surrounded himself with a cabinet of people who had really thought and written about this. He brought in the economist John Maynard Keynes to think about what public investment could mean in a strategic way to change inequality. That was the entire project of FDR's 4 terms as president. He was a wealthy man. He came from the aristocracy. He was a traitor to his class. And I have to say to you, I am a very proud traitor to my class. I don't think my class is doing the world a lot of good. And FDR felt the same way. And so he started programs. What he understood from John Maynard Keynes was, if with public spending for public benefit, things can be made to change in the direction of greater equality. So the Social Security Administration was set up during the 1930s. Of every single government program on this planet, nothing has done more to pull people out of poverty than the Social Security Administration. Welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start. I can name 20 different programs that were working just fine until Donald Trump most recently took office, working incredibly well. And millions upon millions and upon millions of lives were altered because of those things. Some of those things had been pioneered in the nonprofit sector, supported by philanthropy, right? So now we're talking a really interesting relationship between philanthropy and structural change that can be very profound. And through the 1950s and 60s, these programs continued to work, they continued to grow. We had the civil rights movement, we had the war on poverty, and so forth. In the early 1970s, it was this moneyed interest class who got together and made a decision on a 50-year plan, 50-year plan, and they invested very heavily in it. And if you want to find it, Google it. It's called the Powell Memo. I keep popping my P's. The Powell Memo, you can find it online, and it is an extraordinary thing. It's like standing in a house and you're reading the blueprints for the house you're standing in. They achieved and accomplished every single goal that they had in the Powell Memo over the last 50 years. And so what we're looking at now in the United States is we've reestablished the same wealth inequality we had in the 1920s. We've abolished many of the programs that were set forth to address that. So it can be changed, as we've seen, with FDR and everything after the Depression era. And even your most radical Republican, like Eisenhower, supported much of the social infrastructure that was created by FDR in the 1930s. And then we've seen it change again. This is a question of grabbing a hold of our best, mightiest resources, which are us, each other, one another, and demanding better from our politicians, holding the wealthy accountable for the abuses, and making sure that the government is a government that answers to people.
Muito bom, muito interessante, uma aula da filantropia americana, vou ter que ouvir depois de novo. Eu acho muito interessante essa relação que você trouxe, e acho que é um tema do momento, entre a política pública, a filantropia. Acho que esse é um tema que a gente vem olhando ao longo dos 30 anos de GIFE, de um momento de maior profissionalização aqui no Brasil da filantropia, porque, de fato, o impacto das ações na filantropia e governo, enfim, a escala é outra, né? Ao mesmo tempo, eu acho que a gente também tem uma relação, que você trouxe na sua fala, entre eleições, entre política e filantropia. E acho que não dá para fugir do tema do momento, que é o desmantelamento das políticas públicas nos Estados Unidos, nesse governo Trump, e também esse desfinanciamento, né, esse defunding de ações que estão apoiando a sociedade civil e o bem público. Então, eu queria te ouvir um pouco sobre a sua perspectiva da filantropia nos Estados Unidos hoje, se ela está ameaçada, como é que você vê isso, que leitura que você faz sobre esse momento, e também que perspectivas você vê, que saídas são possíveis, ou que te parecem, enfim, tá ali no horizonte.
I don't think all philanthropy is threatened in the United States because there's a lot of philanthropy that went into the process of building us toward the election in 2024. It was philanthropy that supported the Powell memos being written and distributed and widely known and acted upon in every different sphere, media, universities, all of it. So that was all philanthropy. And so what we know is philanthropy can structurally change a country if it wants to, if it's coordinated, if it's communicating. So first of all, the philanthropy of the people not on the bad side needs to learn from that. We need to learn from that. We need to talk to each other. Philanthropists are not good at playing with each other in the sandbox. I don't know, do you have sandboxes in your playgrounds here? I'm not sure. But anyway, we don't share our toys. We don't share our plans. We don't say, you know, you have an idea there, I have an idea here. Why don't we work together to make it work better for all of us and maybe grow more? So that's the first thing, is philanthropy needs to coordinate better and needs to be in constant communication. The philanthropy I'm worried about in the United States is obviously the Ford Foundation, OSI, the philanthropy that talks overtly about things like social justice, things like diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion. I mean, the Trump administration has very brazenly established thought and language crimes. They've driven the word feminism off of every government website. I mean, and DEI, they've gone after, well, DEI just means diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can you not support that? How can you, much less, how can you drive that from every government website? So the philanthropies that have been overtly supporting those values, which I understand as democratic values, those are democratic values, they may be looking at harassment from the tax service, certainly from Attorney General's office and so forth, to be accused of things like discrimination against white people. I'm sure that's going to be happening soon enough, and I'm worried for them. So, but what I'm really worried about more than that is fear. I think that the small and mid-sized philanthropies will be retracting and worrying for themselves and worrying about what's going to happen to them. Wow. My president is listening. Woo. Take that, Donald. So, like I say, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of our fear. I am afraid of our fear. I know that in my life, every stupid decision I've ever made, I've made because I was afraid. You know, and the things that make me less afraid is working with and being with like-minded people, because I know I'm not alone. I feel like I can do anything when I know I'm in a group of people who feels the same way. And so in the last couple years, I've gotten more public about my, I guess, opinions, precisely because I'm just not as afraid as I used to be. And I think that if you're in a small to mid-sized philanthropy, if you have an endowment, now is the time. This is an emergency. Look around the world. This is a global emergency of democracy and oligarchy. And right now, it doesn't look good. And if those of us who have the means to defend democracy do not step up to do so, we will be looking at a long and dark period.
Fantástico. Tem muitas perguntas, e agora eu vou falar igual os ingressos do Congresso GIFE. Não mandem mais perguntas, não dá mais. Não tem como atender mais as perguntas. Eu vou tocar 2 temas. Algumas perguntas que vieram, creio que a Abigail já tocou aqui, vieram bastante sobre o contexto internacional, as questões dos Estados Unidos. Parece-me que tem 2, uma ligada ao terceiro setor, né? Queria ouvi-la sobre o papel do terceiro setor na advocacy, na mudança sistêmica, como fiel da balança e desconcentração de poder, por que a filantropia tem dificuldade de apoiar ações de advocacy do terceiro setor? Então, queria te escutar um pouco dessa relação filantropia-terceiro setor. E tem uma questão que a gente também gostaria que você falasse, que eu vou até ler, porque parece um jabá, mas não é. Pensando nos desafios do GIFE em promover uma filantropia no Brasil que enfrente as desigualdades, que ações você tem visto na sua jornada que foram efetivas para promover esse tipo de filantropia? Então, se você quiser partilhar com a gente alguma ação, algum case em relação a isso. Obrigado, Abigail.
I think there are 2 things. Yes. Hi, everybody. I think there are 2 things that people in the moneyed class, the people with enough wealth to be thinking about philanthropy and talking about philanthropy, 2 things that they need to do. One is they need to think differently about, so somebody told me this story of when I was first starting out, that there's a river and there are babies in the river and they're drowning. So what do? First thing you do, you run in and you pull the babies out of the river. That's what anyone would do. And then after a while, someone comes along and they come in and they start teaching the babies to swim, right? And that's a really good way of handling it, because then you have a longer-term solution. And that's where most philanthropy is right now. We're teaching babies to swim. But very little philanthropy is invested in who is throwing babies in the river, right? Why is someone throwing babies in the river? Going upstream and figuring that out. And that is activism and organizing. And standard philanthropy is almost allergic to that. It's scary to them, because that's where things start to get a little messy, right? Because some of what an activist and an organizer might want from you as a wealthy person may not feel very comfortable. It may be a challenge to your wealth and your position. I wish wealthy people were less afraid of that confrontation, because there are places and ways in which that confrontation can be very healthy for you mental health-wise. You need to be told the uncomfortable things. There are uncomfortable things all the time that you must hear. And the wealthier you become, the more insulated you are from the unpleasant pieces of information. I'm telling you this part about not being afraid is because that's where I spend my time, is in the places where I get told the dark things. And I will tell you that in terms of my general well-being, I've never been better, because every day I get out of bed and I know I'm being honest with myself. I know I tell the truth. So the second thing isn't really philanthropy so much as it is about wealthy people as individuals organizing themselves. As the same way, you've got a little group about housing out in the favelas in Rio. They organize. We all know about that kind of organizing. But there's a certain belief. When you inherit money, you're told from the beginning, your job is to spend as little of this as possible on taxes. Because taxes are always and everywhere bad. They are never good. And if you fight the government, you fight for lower taxes. I understand that governments are inefficient. I understand that governments are corrupt and terrible. I understand all of that. We've all seen it. But they're governments, right? They're accountable to people, us, right? And if it's bad, you fight it. If you rely on philanthropists for the things that governments do, there's nothing you can do if they're doing it badly or wrong. They're not accountable. The only way to affect people systemically is through government programs, and the only way to change the nature of government programs is to fix the government and pay your taxes. We had a Supreme Court justice. So Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, "Taxes are the price I pay for a civilized society." And you know, a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump and are watching Elon Musk with pleasure take things apart are starting to appreciate how well things were working. Yes, it was corrupt. Yes, it was inefficient. Yes, it was frustrating. All of these things are always true of every government. This is always the case. But we had a social security administration that made sure that disabled people were not living in abject poverty or on the street, right? We had a Medicare program that made sure that if you're homeless and penniless, you can show up to the emergency room and get treated medically, even if you didn't have the money to pay for that. We had a Federal Aviation Administration that made sure the planes weren't running into helicopters all the time. We had a public education system that made sure every public school in the country was well enough supplied with money, access, equipment, and so forth. Those things are very steadily starting to fall apart, plus many, many, many more. Taxes are why we are citizens. And in the United States, I pay a lower effective tax rate because of the tax structure than my assistant does. My assistant on her salary that she makes every year. I'm not a magician. I'm just taking advantage of every tax benefit I have. I mainly pay that lower rate because of the capital gains. When I sell stock, I pay a capital gains tax. That's 20%. Or is it 15 now? I can't remember. She pays a 28% rate on her salary. Why is work taxed higher than the buying and selling of capital? We were told that it would stimulate investment, and I have never, ever met an investor who made a decision about whether or not to invest something if he thought it would be profitable based on what the tax rate was going to be. That's just nonsense. So wealthy people have a lot to say about how bad taxes are and what a stupid idea. But I have to say, it's a simple idea, and it's kind of the only idea. If you go to Davos, what you will first notice on the airway, on the runway, that's the word, is basically a traffic jam. They don't have enough room for all the private airplanes that come into Davos. They don't have enough room. There's just not enough room. And they actually have the gall to fly in on those private planes and go to sessions talking about global warming. Honestly, if you can sustain emotionally and psychologically that level of hypocrisy in your everyday life, what else are you looking the other way for? In New York City, every day, I walk past a person who sleeps on the sidewalk, even on the coldest days in wintertime. And you have to do that constantly, and you learn, I can't help everybody, so I can't look. If you're comfortable with that, think about it. Think of what else you're comfortable at. I mean, if every wealthy person actually held their own feet to the fire and asked themselves, am I really living, I was raised a Christian, am I really living Christ's values? Because I remember the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew says, you shall know them by their fruits, right? In other words, you'll know what they meant to accomplish, not by what they said about what they were trying to accomplish, but what they actually created. You shall know them by their fruits. The fruits of what the wealthy class has said about doing are terrible and very intentional. There's an expression going around the tech sector right now called soft eugenics. Have you heard this expression? It is, just go ahead and let the poor people starve. We have too many of them. And then we'll make sure the good people, the smart people, the white people have more babies. They are calling that soft eugenics. It's a term they're using without shame in rooms among themselves. And yes, this is a big piece of what's happening now in the United States. The last film I made was about people who worked at Disneyland because they were being paid really badly, and the full-time workers there couldn't bring enough money home to feed their families. So they were starting a food pantry for full-time workers, getting paid $11 an hour. And that's basically true for half of the workers in America. I know we have a reputation for being very fat, but actually that's connected into the starving problem, weirdly enough, because people are reduced to eating such terrible food, like McDonald's every day, because it's the only food that's within reach for them. So we are looking at soft eugenics. It's not that the poor will starve, it's that they will die of early heart attacks and hypertension and diabetes and all the things that come from a diet of straight up McDonald's. So we need to take our society back, right? We need to overcome this narrative that each of us is just one individual fighting and fighting, and hopefully one day I'll be a billionaire. That's first of all never gonna happen, never. It's like if you think you can be in the NBA and play for the Lakers, it's the same likelihood of being a billionaire. So just let that go, because everything you can achieve with other people is more satisfying, and over the long time will take better care of you in life. We need to let go of the idea that this is some kind of race we need to win. This is a walk, and we walk together. That's what we need among the wealthy as individuals, between the wealthy and everyone else. That is when we're undefeatable.
Uau! Bom, chegamos aqui no... Agora que está funcionando, ela não estava ouvindo, mas agora está, os dois. Chegamos ao final do nosso tempo. Eu queria várias perguntas interessantes, vou te passar para você saber o que estava aqui no imaginário de algumas pessoas, para você. Mas queria te convidar para algumas considerações finais, se você quiser. Nós temos aqui um dado da filantropia nacional brasileira. Ele é um setor muito feminino, a filantropia, né? Mas a gente continua reproduzindo as desigualdades de gênero, né? Porque tem mais lideranças masculinas do que femininas no Brasil na filantropia. Então, se você quiser fazer algumas considerações em relação a essas contradições que a gente vê. E o GIFE tem feito muito esforço para as organizações, para que elas sejam mais brasileiras. Ser mais brasileira na nossa concepção é que elas tenham a diversidade do nosso país. O Brasil, 56% da população é negra, que aqui a gente considera brown and black, pardos e pretos. São 56%, temos a nossa população indígena, amarela, e que as organizações sejam mais brasileiras, que reflitam isso. Então, te convido para fazer as considerações finais, e se você puder passar um pouco por essas questões de equidade de gênero e de raça, te agradeço.
Very easy for the last question. Hi. And then halfway I'll go there. Yeah, the thing about it's a very feminine sector, especially in the activism space of it, and the people who are starting the organizations and organizing people and thinking of campaigns, they tend to very dominate as women. And then in the lower levels, in the grant-making part of philanthropy, you find a lot of women. And as in every single institution, the closer you get to the money, the fewer women you find. So yes, up in leadership, it's predominantly male and non of color, we'll put it that way, non-black or brown. So the changes start with intention, right? I mean, so Donald Trump has wiped the words DEI from everybody's thing, and he's punishing organizations that take DEI. That's okay. That's never been the important part. And when that was the focus, it was always bad work, and it was always tokens. How about this? How about we live like everybody matters just as much as everybody else? What if we just made the choice to do that? And as white people and wealthy people, what if we made the choice to notice? Because really, this is just a question of noticing, really. I'm in a room full of other white people. Why is that? I mean, I had to be taught to notice. And when I started noticing, I never saw people of color. I was always the only woman. So teach yourself, wealthy white people, to notice. And then what I would always get, when I did some work with private equity in my family's company, and I would say to the guys who were hiring, they were always guys, like, where are the women? And they'd say, we just can't find them. Where are the women? And I don't know if you remember Mitt Romney years ago when he was running for president. He said, I have binders full of women. It's one of my favorite things. And, there are plenty of women. The question is, why didn't you see them? And you don't see them, and you don't see the people of color because they don't look like leadership to you, because what looks like leadership is white and male. So you need to notice the things that you are looking for in leadership, and then you need to go the extra mile to include. That's all. It's just a decision to behave differently within the confines of a highly segregated society. And the more people you move in at the bottom, the more people you move up through. That is like planting an oak tree. The Chinese say the best time to plant an oak tree is 50 years ago, and the second best time is today. So that's what we need to be doing. When I think about the Ford Foundation, which is one of the great American institutions, and one of the earliest investors in the idea that the Ivy League institutions needed to bring in more people of color because education was not well distributed. If not for the Ford Foundation, no Barack Obama. That is a direct relationship. He went to law school, he went to Columbia and then went on to Harvard Law School because of a tradition of grant making, if not directly afford grants, that it said that I don't care if you can't afford this, you seem an important enough person with enough capacity that we should invest in your life. So that's visionary grant making. That's grant making for 50 years and thinking about long-term structural change. And that is something that each of us, especially the wealthy white people, need to kind of just let into our hearts. We need to change the way we see the world, and we need to ask ourselves hard questions about every room we're sitting in.
Maravilhoso. Muito, muito obrigada pela participação. Obrigada, Abigail. Maravilhoso. Foi ótimo te ouvir. Muito inspirador, e acho que a gente começa aqui esse congresso, enfim, com um momento assim de reflexão, de inspiração, e é isso. Próximos passos, Cássio.
Eu vou chamar a Lorena. Eu acho que é isso que eu tenho que fazer. Super obrigada, Abigail.
Muitíssimo
Muito
obrigada.
obrigada.